4 years, audiences knew Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney as Frasier and Martin Crane, one of television's most memorable father and son pairs. Their relationship on Frasier worked because the two characters could not have been more different. Frasier was educated, polished, and obsessed with fine food, music, and culture, while Martin was a retired police officer who preferred simple things and had little patience for his son's fancy lifestyle. Their arguments were often funny, but underneath the humor was something much more powerful: love. What viewers saw on screen as a fictional father and son eventually became connected to something deeply personal in Grammer's real life. When Frasier was being created, Grammer wanted John Mahoney to play Martin. Mahoney had appeared in a memorable episode of Cheers, and Grammer had enjoyed working with him so much that he personally contacted him about the new show. He asked Mahoney to look at the script and said he wanted him to play his father. Mahoney agreed, and a television partnership that would last for 11 seasons was born. But there was another reason this relationship became so meaningful to Grammer. He had lost his own father when he was only 13, leaving a gap in his life that could never truly be replaced. Years later, Grammer explained that his time with Mahoney gave him an understanding of what it might have been like to have a father. That statement changes the way viewers can look back at Frasier. Martin Crane was not Grammer's real father, of course, and Mahoney was not simply a replacement for someone who had died. But their friendship gave Grammer something he had missed during an important part of his life: the experience of spending years with an older man he respected, trusted, and genuinely cared about. For 11 seasons, audiences watched them play father and son. Behind the scenes, those years became part of Grammer's personal story as well. The story becomes even more emotional when looking at what John Mahoney brought to the role of Martin Crane. Mahoney did not play Martin as a perfect father. Martin could be stubborn, loud, old-fashioned, and sometimes difficult. Yet he was also loyal, protective, funny, and deeply caring toward his sons. Those qualities made him feel real. He was not the kind of television father who always knew the right thing to say. He was an ordinary man trying to understand children who had grown into very different adults. That made the relationship between Martin and Frasier feel natural. The two could argue about almost anything, but there was always an understanding underneath their disagreements. According to those close to the production, the chemistry between Grammer and Mahoney helped make their scenes believable. Mahoney's calm and steady personality gave him a natural presence around Grammer, and that quality may have been especially important because of Grammer's own history. He had lost his father as a teenager, so the idea of having an older man in his life for such a long period carried a meaning that went beyond the workplace. Grammer later explained that his 11 years with Mahoney helped him understand what it might have been like to have a father. That is an extraordinary thing to hear from someone about a former co-star. It suggests that Mahoney's influence was not limited to acting advice or professional friendship. He became part of Grammer's understanding of family itself. Viewers could see a version of that connection every week when Martin and Frasier shared a meal, argued about something small, or simply sat together in the same room. The comedy worked because there was affection underneath it. Martin could criticize his son, and Frasier could become frustrated with his father, but neither relationship ever felt empty. There was always a reason for them to come back to each other. In many ways, that became the heart of the show. And when people later learned how important Mahoney had become to Grammer personally, those familiar television moments took on a completely different meaning. As the years passed, Frasier became one of television's most successful sitcoms, and the relationship between Martin and Frasier became one of its emotional foundations. Viewers became attached to the entire Crane family, but Martin's presence gave the show something different from many other sitcoms. He brought an older, more grounded point of view into a home filled with complicated ideas and personalities. His sons could talk about opera, psychology, restaurants, and expensive wine, but Martin often brought the conversation back to ordinary life. That difference created comedy, but it also created balance. John Mahoney's performance made Martin believable because he understood that the character did not need to win every argument. Sometimes Martin simply needed to be present. His relationship with Frasier slowly became warmer, even when the two continued to disagree. This gradual change was important because it showed that families do not have to be perfect to be loving. People can misunderstand each other and still care deeply. For Kelsey Grammer, those 11 seasons meant more than professional success. He was able to work beside Mahoney year after year, creating memories that would remain long after the camera stopped. The relationship eventually became much more than something written by television writers. It became part of Grammer's personal history. He had lost his father early in life, but he had unexpectedly found an older friend who could give him a different experience of what a father-son relationship could feel like. The years could not change the past, but they gave him something new to remember. And sometimes, that is what matters most. People cannot always repair the things that happened when they were young, but they can still form relationships later in life that help them understand those experiences in a different way. John Mahoney became one of those relationships for Kelsey Grammer, and that is why their story continues to feel so much bigger than a television sitcom. As the years went by, the bond between Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney became one of the most meaningful parts of Frasier, but their relationship was never built only on the scenes viewers saw on television. What made their connection special was the amount of time they spent together away from the cameras as well. 11 seasons is a long time for any group of actors to work together, and during those years, Grammer and Mahoney experienced the normal pressures of a major television production while continuing to develop a genuine friendship. Their characters often disagreed, but the actors themselves had a strong respect for one another. Mahoney's calm and steady personality gave him a natural presence around Grammer, and that quality may have been especially important because of Grammer's own history. He had lost his father as a teenager, so the idea of having an older man in his life for such a long period carried a meaning that went beyond the workplace. Grammer later explained that his 11 years with Mahoney helped him understand what it might have been like to have a father. That is an extraordinary thing to hear from someone about a former co-star. It suggests that Mahoney's influence was not limited to acting advice or professional friendship. He became part of Grammer's understanding of family itself. Viewers could see a version of that connection every week when Martin and Frasier shared a meal, argued about something small, or simply sat together in the same room. The comedy worked because there was affection underneath it. Martin could criticize his son, and Frasier could become frustrated with his father, but neither relationship ever felt empty. There was always a reason for them to come back to each other. In many ways, that became the heart of the show. And when people later learned how important Mahoney had become to Grammer personally, those familiar television moments took on a completely different meaning. What once looked like simple sitcom storytelling began to feel like a small reflection of something much deeper that existed between the two actors. John Mahoney's death in 2018 changed the way Kelsey Grammer looked at the Frasier story. For many fans, Mahoney's passing meant losing one of the most important members of the original cast. For Grammer, it was also the loss of someone who had played an important role in his personal life for more than a decade. Mahoney had not simply been part of an old television show. He had been there during 11 years of Grammer's life, years filled with work, success, pressure, laughter, and countless memories. That is why the possibility of bringing Frasier back without him was difficult. When the revival was eventually discussed, Grammer understood that the new series could not pretend Martin Crane had never existed. The character had to be remembered because the actor who played him had meant so much to everyone involved. Grammer explained that the new show needed to acknowledge that John was gone and Martin was gone. He then connected that absence to his own new position, saying that he had now become the father figure himself. That statement carries several layers of meaning. On the surface, it refers to the fictional world of Frasier. But underneath it is also about Grammer's own life. The man who once played a son beside Mahoney had reached an age where he was now playing the older generation himself. The person who had once looked toward Mahoney as a father figure was now stepping into that role for a new generation. It is a strange circle that life sometimes creates. The young man who lost his father early eventually found another father-like relationship as an adult, only to lose that person too. Years later, he returned to the same fictional world without him. Instead of hiding the absence, Grammer chose to make it part of the story. That decision made the revival more than a simple return of an old television program. It became a way to acknowledge the people who could not return and the memories they left behind. One of the most touching parts of the story is the way John Mahoney's memory was carried into the new Frasier era through small details rather than one large dramatic tribute. The new bar being named Mahoney's became a quiet reference to the actor who had played Martin Crane. The use of the name John for a younger character also served as another subtle reminder. These details may seem small to someone watching casually, but to longtime Frasier viewers they carry real emotional weight. They show that Mahoney was not forgotten simply because the original series had ended years earlier. His memory remained connected to the characters and the people who created the show. This is often how real grief works. People do not always remember someone through one huge speech or ceremony. Sometimes they remember them through a name, a favorite place, an old photograph, a familiar joke, or something as simple as a location that carries a special meaning. In that sense, The tributes connected the old show with the new one. They allowed Mahoney's presence to remain without pretending that he was still there. That distinction matters. The revival could never truly recreate the original cast because life had changed. But it could respect what came before. For Grammer, that meant acknowledging the man who had played his father on television and who had also given him a deeper understanding of fatherhood in his personal life. It also meant accepting that the relationship had ended in one form while its influence continued in another. The story of Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney, therefore, became about more than a famous actor mourning a former colleague. It became about memory, gratitude, and the strange way people can remain part of our lives even after they are gone. Mahoney could no longer stand beside Grammer on a television set, but the years they spent together had already become part of Grammer's life story. That is something death could not take away. When Kelsey Grammer eventually spoke openly about John Mahoney, the most powerful part was not simply that he missed his former co-star. It was the way he described what Mahoney had meant to him personally. Grammer's words suggested that the relationship had changed his understanding of fatherhood itself. He had lost his own father when he was young, and for much of his adult life, that absence remained part of his story. Then, almost unexpectedly, he spent 11 years working beside a man who played his father every week on television. Over time, that fictional relationship became connected to a real friendship, and Grammer later said that being around Mahoney gave him an understanding of what it might have been like to have had a father. That makes Mahoney's death especially painful because Grammer was not simply saying goodbye to an actor who had shared a successful television series with him. He was saying goodbye to someone who had become an important part of his understanding of family. When Grammer later discussed returning to Frasier, he became visibly emotional while talking about Mahoney. He explained that the show could not return without honoring him, because John was gone and Martin was gone. Then came the idea that seemed to connect his entire life together. After losing the father he had known in the series, Grammer was now becoming the father figure himself. It was a simple idea, but it carried years of history behind it. A boy who had lost his father early in life had eventually become a man who found a father-like relationship through his work. Then that relationship ended too. Now, instead of remaining only the son, he had reached the stage of life where others could look to him as the older generation. In that sense, Mahoney's influence did not end when he died. It continued through the lessons, memories, and feelings he had left behind. The story became less about replacing one person with another, and more about how people can shape us even when they never realize how deeply they have done so. The return of Frasier also gave Grammer a chance to honor Mahoney without pretending that the past could simply be recreated. Television revivals can be difficult because audiences often want everything to feel exactly as it did before. But real life does not work that way. People grow older, relationships change, and some people are no longer there. The revival had to accept those changes. Martin Crane could not simply return because John Mahoney was no longer alive to play him. Instead, his memory became part of the new story. Small tributes, including the name Mahoney's for a bar and the name John for a younger character, became quiet reminders of the man who had once been at the center of the original show. These details allowed the people behind Frasier to say something simple without turning the entire revival into a memorial. John mattered, and he would not be forgotten. For Grammer, that message was probably even more personal. He had already explained how Mahoney gave him a sense of what having a father might have been like. So remembering Mahoney was also a way of remembering a very important period of his own life. The years they spent together could not be repeated, but they could be carried forward. That is one of the most meaningful parts of their story. We often think that relationships end when people are separated by death, but memories can continue influencing the people who remain. A mentor's advice can stay with us. A parent's habits can appear in the way we raise our own children. A friend's sense of humor can return when we least expect it. In Grammer's case, the lessons of his relationship with Mahoney became part of the man he had grown into. The actor who once played Martin's son was now old enough to become a father figure himself. The circle had quietly closed. Ultimately, the story of Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney is not really a story about a television show ending or a famous actor losing a co-star. It is a story about how unexpected relationships can become some of the most important relationships in our lives. John Mahoney entered Grammer's world because of a casting decision, but he stayed because the two men genuinely connected. Mahoney became Martin Crane, the gruff father who could argue with Frasier 1 minute and protect him the next. At the same time, outside the cameras, he became a trusted older presence in Grammer's life. After 11 seasons together, The relationship had become impossible to separate completely from the memories of that period. When Mahoney died, Grammer lost someone whose importance went far beyond television. Years later, his emotional reaction to discussing the Frasier revival showed that the loss was still meaningful. He did not want the new series to ignore Mahoney's absence. Instead, he wanted the story to acknowledge that Martin was gone and that life had moved forward. That may be the real truth behind Grammer's relationship with Mahoney. John was not simply the actor who played his television father. He became the closest thing to a father figure Grammer felt he had experienced in his adult life, arriving decades after the loss of his own father and remaining in his life long enough to leave a lasting mark. And perhaps that is why the story still affects people years later. Fame, awards, and television success eventually fade, but the relationships we build can remain with us. John Mahoney left behind a remarkable acting career, but for Kelsey Grammer, his greatest legacy may have been something much more personal: the memory of a man who helped him understand fatherhood, friendship, and loss in a way he could never have learned from a script. Mahoney may be gone, but the role he played in Grammer's life did not disappear with him. It became part of the man Grammer is today, and that may be the most lasting tribute of all. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next story.